Night in St. Petersburg drapes itself in a melancholic quiet. A place where silent stories unfold beneath the yellow glow of streetlights. Anya Petrova, a former Judo champion with an outwardly calm demeanor but a wellspring of hidden strength, had just finished teaching a late self-defense class. The bright lights of the arena had given way to a simpler life. But that peace was shattered by the arrival of 3 police officers. They had no idea that their taunts and invasive actions towards one woman would ignite a chain of uncontrollable events, exposing deep cracks within the police force and the community. A seemingly fleeting encounter became the spark for a silent yet weighty confrontation. The streets of Charlotte at night carried their own distinct sound, not loud or bustling, but a low, steady rhythm, like a whisper among the old trees. A gentle reminder that life, even in its quietest moments, never truly sleeps. Porch lights flickered dimly behind lace curtains, the air carrying the scent of freshly cut hay, mingling with the rich fragrance of magnolias and the soft rustle of Spanish moss in the gentle breeze, painting everything with an old-world stillness. Into that southern hush walked Jasmine Williams, tall, with a strong, athletic build and warm brown skin. Her steps were measured and calm, without haste. It seemed nothing could rush her anymore. She had just finished teaching her Thursday night self-defense class at the local community center on Moorhead Avenue. It wasn't a formal job, more of a calling. The women who came weren't there to become fighters. They sought something deeper: protection, confidence, a way to reclaim what they had lost in silence. Some were young and filled with fear, others older with the hardened look of survival etched behind their eyes. Jasmine gave them what she could: a place to feel strong again. After all, she had once been strong too. Incredibly strong, enough to earn a name on national television, to hear her name echoed in sports broadcasts and gymnasiums. But that was a long time ago. Back then, she was that girl on ESPN, the Taekwondo champion with a stance as solid as stone but movements as fluid as the wind. Sponsors came calling, as did photographers, TV producers, and brand managers. Then came the knee. One bad landing in a televised match in Dallas, and everything unraveled like a loose thread on a cheap garment. They loved her until she limped. Then they called her difficult. And finally, they stopped calling altogether. Now, she had no desire to win them back. Her world had become smaller, but infinitely more peaceful. She lived in a second-floor apartment above a used bookstore on Trade Street. Her routine was simple: classes, coffee, and the long, silent walks she had come to crave. Tonight, she wore a black cotton dress that fell just below her knees and white sneakers worn from use. The bag slung across her shoulder was heavy with pads and training gear. And as always, she walked alone. The neighborhood wasn't the safest, but it was hers. She knew the cracks in the sidewalk, the lean of the trees, the tilting mailbox at the corner of Tryon like a friend who had seen one too many storms. She had just passed the corner grocery store with its neon, open, sign flickering, even though it hadn't been open past 9 p.m. in years. Suddenly, she sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Not quite fear, but a change in the fabric of the night. As if the air had taken a long, deep inhale, she continued walking, not turning, not needing to. The slow roll of tires behind her, deliberate and smooth, told her what was there: a police cruiser. No lights, no siren, just a presence. She let her steps continue as if nothing had changed. But her muscles, trained by years of combat and instinct, had already taken inventory of every shadow, every possible escape route. The car drew closer. She could hear the low murmur of voices inside. Then a soft, sneering chuckle, laced with a kind of confidence born not from kindness but from power. Well, a voice drawled from the open window. The southern charm twisted into condescension. "Ain't you a sight to see tonight?" Another voice, deeper and less amused, added, "Ain't it past your curfew, sweetheart?" Jasmine didn't respond, not because she was afraid, but because she had learned long ago that some responses don't require sound, they require stillness. Behind her, the cruiser didn't pass. It slowed further, almost idling. She turned the corner onto Drayton as she always did. And so did they. Another comment followed, louder now. What's a thick brown girl like you doing walking all alone out here? Looking for trouble? Still, she said nothing. A pause. Then the passenger door opened. One of the officers stepped out, walking with a swagger more suited to a high school hallway than a city street. Young, clean-shaven, close-cut hair, maybe in his mid-20s. He approached her side with a kind of mock politeness. "Hold on a second," he said, his eyes scanning her up and down as if she were inventory. "Aren't you that karate chick from TV? Damn, didn't think you'd be this real up close." He smirked. Jasmine continued walking, but now she could see his shadow beside hers, matching her pace. "You used to kick people in the face for a living, huh?" he said. "Guess now you're just kicking it in the hood like the rest of your people." He laughed at his own joke. The car behind them crept forward, just slow enough to stay in sync. From inside, another officer called out, "Careful there, Kyle, she might actually drop kick your dumbass." Laughter crackled through the still night. Jasmine adjusted her grip on the strap of her bag. Not from tension, just a recalibration. Kyle, or whatever his name was, stepped a little closer. "You know," he said, his voice dropping, "a girl wearing a dress like that, well, some folks might get ideas." Then, without warning, he reached down and flicked the back of her dress upward. Not a grab, not aggressive, just a casual, demeaning flick, enough to shame, enough to claim a sense of power. The laughter behind her cracked through the still night like glass under a boot. One of them honked the horn twice. Jasmine stopped walking. She didn't turn, not yet, not immediately. For a single breath, she stood there, frozen, not by fear, but by focus. She had known many moments in her life: triumph, failure, silence, noise. But this was different. This wasn't a match she had trained for. This was something worse. Then she turned, her body shifting like a tide. Slow, controlled, her eyes locked onto his. The young officer, Kyle, froze mid-smirk. Something in her gaze unspooled him. Her voice, when it came, was calm, measured. "You think this is funny?" she asked. He faltered, then tried to regain ground. "Relax, it was just a joke." "No," she said, stepping closer. "You don't get to joke about me. Not tonight." He raised a hand, unsure now. "We were just messing around." Her hand moved in a blur. She grabbed his wrist, twisted it behind his back, pulled him forward until he bent at the waist with a grunt. He didn't even have time to resist. The second officer bolted from the car. Jasmine moved instinctively, spinning, using the momentum to drive her elbow into his side. A clean hit, just under the rib cage, right where body armor ends. He stumbled. The third officer stayed in the driver's seat, hand hovering near his gun. But he didn't draw it. He was still watching, thinking. Jasmine stood there, her breath steady, her chest rising and falling like the waves off Tybee Beach. She looked at them all, their uniforms, their weapons, their confusion, and said nothing. She didn't need to. She turned and walked away. And no one stopped her. Jasmine's footsteps echoed down the quiet street. The rhythm of her sneakers on the pavement now slower, almost meditative. She wasn't in a hurry. Never was. The adrenaline had receded, but her breathing remained steady, her pulse calm. Behind her, the patrol car remained still. She could still feel their presence. No longer a threat, but an awkwardness, a silence, an unanswered question hanging in the thick North Carolina air. She turned onto Trade Street and disappeared into the long shadows cast by the flickering streetlights. Her apartment was 3 blocks away, and she walked those final minutes as if she hadn't just disarmed 2 uniformed police officers and stared down a third without uttering another word. Morning light streamed through the gap in her blinds, revealing nothing of the previous night's events. The small apartment smelled faintly of strong coffee and sandalwood. She moved through her morning routine slowly and deliberately, stretching, showering, tending to the peace lilies on her kitchen windowsill. Her phone vibrated with routine notifications, a community news brief, a weather alert, and a reminder that her grocery order was ready for pickup. Nothing about the night before. Nothing about the patrol car. Just silence. But silence had its own sound, if you knew how to listen. A few blocks away, inside Charlotte's District 3 police headquarters, a tension was beginning to take root. It started subtly. The officer who had remained in the patrol car, David Miller, 27 and still relatively new to the force, arrived at the precinct with dark circles under his eyes and a tight set to his jaw. He didn't join the usual morning banter, didn't linger by the coffee machine, avoided eye contact with everyone in the briefing room. Officer Kyle Johnson, the one who had flicked Jasmine's dress, was quieter than usual, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on his desk. He didn't laugh at any of the usual jokes, didn't directly mention what had happened, but the air around him had shifted, and in a police precinct, moods spread faster than information. Sergeant Karen Reed, a 22-year veteran who ran the administrative side of things, noticed it before anyone spoke up. She had seen this kind of quiet before, not born of guilt, but of a bruised ego grappling with something it couldn't quite comprehend. When guys like Kyle stopped their boasting and started blinking too much, she knew something was off. Mid-morning, she walked past the break room and caught a snippet of a hushed, sharp whisper. She didn't even need to hear the words. There was the scrape of a chair on the linoleum, followed by the abrupt stop of footsteps as they realized she was there. She kept walking, but she made a mental note. By lunchtime, the unease had spilled beyond hushed tones. One of the dispatchers mentioned overhearing a strange radio call with no corresponding entry in the system. An IT tech reported a missing dashcam video from Kyle's shift, a deletion that didn't follow standard protocol. Then there was the internal feedback system. An anonymous message dropped into the inbox of a junior internal affairs investigator, Daniel Hayes, with a single line: "Look into Patrol Unit 14B. Something happened last night." Daniel almost dismissed it. Most of these anonymous tips were petty grievances or internal politics. But there was something in the tone, quiet, certain, without embellishment, that felt different. He pulled up the patrol logs. The unit had no incident reports filed between 10:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. No traffic stops, no citations, no record of any unusual activity. Just GPS coordinates moving through residential streets, a route that took them past the elementary school near Trade Street. Too late for a school zone patrol, too quiet for a service call. Daniel flagged it and noted the officers assigned to the car: Officer Kyle Johnson, Officer Marcus Jones, and Officer David Miller. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared at his monitor. By that evening, the initial ripple had become a current. Sergeant Reed passed Officer Miller in the parking lot. He was pacing between two rows of patrol cars, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and anxious. "She caught fragments. She grabbed me. No, not like that. I didn't know what she was going to do. She didn't intervene." But she added another mental note. Then, like a match dropped into dry grass, the rumors started. A training officer from the next shift mentioned hearing something about a civilian taking down cops. Someone else said a woman had thrown two officers and just walked away. Another mentioned the name Jasmine. No one knew how they knew her name, but someone remembered seeing her on a billboard for a sports clinic years ago. Her face, brown, intense, proud, wasn't easily forgotten. By the next morning, the whispers were impossible to ignore. Captain Charles Jenkins, head of District 3, known more for his gruff voice and outdated mustache than his subtlety, called the three officers into his office without ceremony. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He watched them as they sat down, David fidgeting, Kyle defensive, Marcus strangely silent. "What happened on patrol the other night?" he asked. No one answered, not immediately. David looked at the floor, Marcus at the wall. It was Kyle who finally mumbled, "Nothing, sir." Jenkins didn't blink. "Nothing," he repeated, then leaned back in his chair. "Then I suppose you won't mind Internal Affairs taking a look at your footage, will you?" That was the crack that broke them. David spoke first. "I think we messed up," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The other two turned to him, eyes wide, but he didn't stop. He told the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough for them to understand. They had followed a woman. They had made jokes. They had said things they shouldn't have. Someone had touched her dress. She hadn't reacted the way they expected. She had walked away, and that afterward, something had shifted in the air, something that hadn't settled since. Jenkins said nothing. He just picked up his phone and made a call upstairs. By 4 p.m., Internal Affairs had opened a formal investigation. The patrol car was impounded. Dashcam footage retrieved. Officer David Miller was placed on administrative leave. Officers Marcus Jones and Kyle Johnson followed suit the next day. An internal memo with the phrase, "potential misconduct involving civilian contact," circulated. No names, no press, but the story was out of the building. Quote, Jasmine remained officially unaware of any of this, but she felt it in the way people looked at her the next time she walked into the coffee shop on Central Avenue. The man behind the counter, who usually traded jokes with her, was silent. The regular who always offered to carry her tray looked anxious when she declined. She wasn't a symbol. She wasn't a victim. She was just a woman who had chosen not to shrink. And the city didn't quite know what to do with that. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Officers spoke in clipped sentences. Conversations stopping abruptly when certain names were mentioned. Even those not directly involved felt the strain. It wasn't just about what had happened anymore. It was about what it revealed. The speed at which the story had traveled. The fact that 3 men with badges and weapons had been rendered helpless by a single woman. A woman who hadn't even raised her voice. David Miller, now sitting alone in a dimly lit internal affairs interview room, had recounted his entire story. He admitted to the taunts, the laughter, the flick of the dress, the expectation of fear, and then he described what had actually occurred. The silence, her eyes, the precise, unwavering movements, the way she had taken control without yelling, without threatening, just with her presence. She wasn't scared of us, he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. We were scared of her. The internal affairs investigator sitting across from him paused his writing. You think she should have been scared? David was silent for a long moment, then shook his head. I think we should have been. By the weekend, the city was buzzing with whispers. Headlines appeared quietly, no bold fonts, no shocking photos, just a small article in the bottom half of the local section. 3 officers placed on administrative leave pending internal investigation into civilian encounter. No names, no details, just the barest outline of a potential violation during a routine patrol. But by the time the story hit social media, the dots were being connected. People remembered that Charlotte wasn't New York or Los Angeles. Stories here had a way of seeping through back doors and into diners and barbershops faster than any reporter could type. By the second day, someone had posted an old clip of Jasmine from her fighting days. Her leg snapping boards on ESPN, sweat beading on her forehead, her name echoing through the crowd. Beneath the video, the comments poured in. Is this her? Wait, they messed with her? She still lives here? Jasmine remained officially oblivious to any of it. She stuck to her routine of not going online. Her phone buzzed with unanswered calls, old contacts, former teammates, a reporter from Atlanta who had left 3 increasingly insistent voicemails. Instead, she focused on her morning rituals. She walked her familiar route. She went back to the community center. She taught her Thursday night class. And she waited, not for justice, not for headlines. She waited because she knew that when power was challenged, it rarely retreated quietly. It waited for the right moment to push back. By that evening, the initial ripple had become a current. Sergeant Reed passed Officer Miller in the parking lot. He was pacing between 2 rows of patrol cars. Phone pressed to his ear. His voice low and anxious. She caught fragments. She grabbed me. No. Not like that. I didn't know what she was going to do. She didn't intervene. But she added another mental note. Then, like a match dropped into dry grass, the rumors started. A training officer from the next shift mentioned hearing something about a civilian taking down cops. Someone else said a woman had thrown 2 officers and just walked away. Another mentioned the name Jasmine. No one knew how they knew her name, but someone remembered seeing her on a billboard for a sports clinic years ago. Her face, brown, intense, proud, wasn't easily forgotten. By the next morning, the whispers were impossible to ignore. Captain Charles Jenkins, head of District 3, known more for his gruff voice and outdated mustache than his subtlety, called the 3 officers into his office without ceremony. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He watched them as they sat down, David fidgeting, Kyle defensive, Marcus strangely silent. What happened on patrol the other night? He asked. No one answered. Not immediately. David looked at the floor. Marcus at the wall. It was Kyle who finally mumbled, "Nothing, sir." Jenkins didn't blink. "Nothing," he repeated, then leaned back in his chair. "Then I suppose you won't mind Internal Affairs taking a look at your footage. Will you?" That was the crack that broke them. David spoke first. "I think we messed up," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The other two turned to him, eyes wide, but he didn't stop. He told the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough for them to understand. They had followed a woman. They had made jokes. They had said things they shouldn't have. Someone had touched her dress. She hadn't reacted the way they expected. She had walked away, and that afterward, something had shifted in the air. Something that hadn't settled since. Jenkins said nothing. He just picked up his phone and made a call upstairs. By 4 p.m., Internal Affairs had opened a formal investigation. The patrol car was impounded. Dashcam footage retrieved. Officer David Miller was placed on administrative leave. Officers Marcus Jones and Kyle Johnson followed suit the next day. An internal memo with the phrase, "potential misconduct involving civilian contact," circulated. No names, no press, but the story was out of the building. On Monday, the patrol car reappeared, this time parked directly across the street from her building. Different unit, different faces, but the message was the same. They were watching, not to intimidate, not yet. They were assessing, trying to gauge her next move, whether she would go public, whether she would push things further. She paid them no mind, just sipped her coffee on the sidewalk bench outside her building, her eyes hidden behind unreadable sunglasses. But she felt their gaze. The speculation, the hushed words exchanged between them. Inside the precinct, no one dared to say her name out loud. The three officers remained suspended. David had stopped coming to the precinct altogether, reportedly citing stress and taking a mental health leave. Kyle had hired a lawyer. Marcus refused any further interviews. Every officer in the building knew about the investigation, but no one wanted to touch it. Briefings were shorter, hallways quieter. Every glance lingered a beat longer than it used to. Even those not involved in the incident that night began to choose their words more carefully. The air was thick, not with fear, but with the realization that the illusion of invincibility had cracked. Captain Charles Jenkins, who had once ruled the floor with easy sarcasm and the confidence of a man who believed in his own immunity, kept his office door closed more often now. The pressure had shifted. The questions from Upara weren't just about the incident itself, but about the culture, the precedent. What else had been allowed to slide? He knew what that meant. One wrong move now, and it wouldn't just be 3 officers facing consequences. It could be the entire command structure. So he scheduled sensitivity training, issued new reporting protocols, sent out internal memos about accountability and culture. But everyone knew it wasn't about real change. It was about optics. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued as if nothing had happened. She didn't appear on the news. She didn't file a complaint. She didn't hire a lawyer. That silence unnerved them more than any legal document could. She had spoken, not with words, but with her body, with the way she stood her ground, the way she walked away, the way she made them feel like children playing with a power they didn't understand. One afternoon, as she left the coffee shop on Central Avenue, a man approached her cautiously, mid-40s, dressed in plain clothes but with a bearing that still carried a hint of military posture. He hesitated. "Ms. Williams?" he asked. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. "I work downtown," he said. I wanted to say, there's talk." She waited. He swallowed hard. "They're not afraid of getting caught," he continued. "They're afraid of what you're going to do next." She looked at him, really looked at him, and after a long pause, she gave a small nod. "Is that so?" she said. He nodded back and walked away. The investigation, now under outside review, moved swiftly. Surveillance footage from a nearby dry cleaner partially corroborated Jasmine's account. The missing dashcam video was quietly recovered from a server backup. The Internal Affairs report described misconduct, unauthorized contact, and racially charged escalating language. One line stood out: "Civilian did not provociravat officers." That sentence made its way into another memo, then into a larger report sent to city officials. A name once synonymous with medals and martial arts now appeared in boardrooms and budget meetings. Quietly, reluctantly, inevitably, Jasmine continued her familiar walks. She passed the Rosa Parks mural, freshly touched up after another act of vandalism. She paused for a moment, then moved on. More people recognized her now. Some nodded, some looked away. A few women approached her in grocery aisles or on the sidewalk to say thank you. Not for fighting back, but for not backing down. "My daughter's taking self-defense now. Because of you," one said. Not because she wants to fight, but because she wants to know what it feels like to be in control. Jasmine just smiled, nodded, and kept walking. Weeks passed. One officer was officially suspended without pay. Another resigned before the hearings even began. David, in a move that surprised even his lawyer, volunteered for a second interview. "I don't want to be the guy who lets this slide," he said. "What we did wasn't just stupid. It was part of something bigger. And she stopped it." Internal affairs marked his cooperation as significant, though public opinion had already delivered a deeper verdict. The silence had been broken. And once broken, it never quite healed the same way. Jasmine never made a public statement. She declined interview requests, ignored the emails offering to tell her story, because the truth wasn't something she needed to explain. It was evident in the way she stood, in the way she refused to flinch, in the way an entire police department had wobbled under the weight of a moment it couldn't define or deny. One morning, as autumn settled over the city and the streets grew crisp with wind, she walked the familiar route she had taken that night, past the closed elementary school, past the leaning fence, past the spot where her dress had been flicked by a stranger's hand. The sidewalk had been patched since then, the streetlights replaced. A new camera now hung on the utility pole at the corner. A city initiative, they said, but the space still held something. Not fear, not shame, just memory. She paused for a second, looked around. No one was there, no one was watching. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and continued walking. Her steps were steady, her shadow stretching long on the pavement in the early morning light. They had tried to reduce her to a moment, but she had become a reflection. And everyone, the officers, the officials, the bystanders, had been forced to look. And this time, they couldn't look away. The story of Jasmine Williams is more than just a moment of confrontation on the streets of Charlotte. It's an echo of the injustice many face. Even after achieving a measure of success in life, Jasmine, from a champion in the arena, became a silent symbol of resilience and self-respect. Her actions, though not loud, struck a powerful blow against the illusion of unchecked power and the simmering racism in society. The officers involved faced consequences, but more important is the awakening this story brought about. It reminds us that no matter who you are, no matter your status, dignity and respect are inviolable values. Jasmine's silence after the incident was not weakness, but a powerful declaration of self-worth and a belief in the strength of truth. Remember, justice is not a gift to be bestowed, but a flame that each of us must keep and protect. Change begins with small actions, with not remaining silent in the face of injustice, and with daring to stand up for better values for the community. Jasmine's story is a testament to that. Let us work together to create a more just and understanding society. If you found this story meaningful, please hit like and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories to come.